So I was having lunch with Scott this week, and he reminded me of a story I'd forgotten about. So if you don't like the story, blame Scott. It's an old Native American story about a wise Cherokee man, a grandparent, who pulled his grandson aside and touched his chest and touched his own and said to him, "Within each and every one of us, there is a great war going on. Within each and every one of us, there are two wolves battling each other. One wolf is anger and resentment, and bitterness. The other wolf, peace and joy and compassion and kindness. And these two wolves are at war within each of our hearts and souls, trying to destroy each other." And the young grandchild, wide-eyed, touching his chest, his heart beating, he asked his grandfather, "Which one wins?" And his grandfather said, "The one you feed." I was struck by that story because, the truth be told, I feel like in the world today, in our society and culture, that it's the angry wolf being fed within my heart and soul. That when I turn on TV and see the talking heads, when I see the most recent hate-filled tweet, when I open up my Facebook and see on there another fake news kind of angry, false story about the world, it just feels like they're feeding in to my anger and resentment and bitterness. It feels like the world and culture we live in is one that feeds that angry wolf over and over again. Would you all agree? And I don't think I'm necessarily alone in that. I find myself in some ways despairing, struggling, as I read of the mass shooting of almost happening every week, as I see the kind of angry vitriol that goes back and forth. I find myself, and I'm confessing, I find myself in some ways despairing, trying to find a space for equanimity, a space for peace about this, and yet it seems like all it is it's feeding this angry wolf inside of me. And I, again, know I'm not alone. I hear friends talk about this, and I know I've talked to church members and their struggle in the midst of this, a sense of despair. The world feeds into our angry wolves. It's almost like the angry wolf is devouring our very souls, right? And so I ask myself, I struggle with this, and I ask this myself, and it may be a very pastor kind of question to ask oneself, but I ask myself over and over, where is the grace? Where is grace in this world that seems to feed the angry wolf, destroying our own souls? Actually, there's interesting data that indicates psychologists who are identifying within our population people struggling with feeling more and more disconnected, people feeling more anxiety, more depression. It is harming our soul. And so I ask myself, where is the grace? Now, we've been talking about grace the past few weeks. We've been kind of unpacking how Paul talks about grace, how grace was this amazing insight he saw into the nature of God, this experience that life isn't about shoulds and should nots, that life isn't about secret shames that we carry around with us. Life isn't about that shame of our own brokenness, that life is a gift. And that our experience of God's love is a gift, unmerited, unearned. It's a radical acceptance of who we are. It is a claim that we are beloved. And that's an incredibly meaningful experience of who God is. That's an experience of grace is one that feeds that wolf of love and kindness and patience. But we actually really struggle with grace because if God's love comes to us unearned and unmerited, why do we do good things? Why should we behave in a certain way? If God's love is given to us without us earning it, it doesn't matter whether we do good or not. So Paul writes this letter and he tells these Christians, he says, clothe yourself, wrap yourself in compassion and kindness and peace. Wrap yourself in that love. Not because it earns you a place in heaven or not because it is a way of being in the world to avoid hell, a kind of hell insurance, right? It's because of this idea, and he says this over and over again, all through his letters. He says, because we should be grateful. He says it, be thankful. Give thanks in all circumstances. Fill your hearts with gratitude. So what flows out of that love and kindness and patience, it comes not from a place of guilt, but of grace. It comes not from a place of having to do it, do's or don'ts, but it flows from a heart filled with Christ, a heart filled with gratitude. Because you can't hate when you feel grateful. You can't be filled with resentment when you are filled with grace and thanksgiving. Now, that's a very ancient spiritual practice. Thousands of years was a prayer of examen by a man named St. Ignatius, and one of the central practices of a Christian was to simply ask yourself each and every day, a prayer of examen, to ask yourself one question: what are you grateful for? In fact, there's a modern version of that where you keep a gratitude journal where you write down each and every day one thing you're grateful for. And I think if we do that, if we engage in that practice, I think it feeds that wolf of compassion and kindness and humility inside us. Now, where is the grace is a hard question because we live in a world filled with the anger and resentment and bitterness of our politics and culture. And it may seem like really a kind of silly thing to do to focus on gratitude and thankfulness. It may seem like, oh, that's kind of Pollyannish, and I understand that. But do you know, does anybody know when Thanksgiving became a national holiday? It wasn't a national holiday when the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower. I'm sorry to shatter that myth. It did not become a national holiday until 1863. And Abraham Lincoln, in the midst of a civil war where tens of thousands of Americans were dying and killing each other, in the midst of this incredible division that seemed overwhelming, in the midst of that, Lincoln makes a national proclamation and sets aside that fourth Thursday of November and said, we will give a day of thanks to God. I mean, that's kind of radical if you think about it. They were killing each other. And yet Lincoln called his nation to give thanks because he knew there is no possibility without gratitude. Now, I haven't seen the movie yet. Has anybody seen Will You Be My Neighbor yet? A few people. I'm sure I've seen the documentary, and I'm sure it's great. Tom Hanks, and I'm sure everybody knows Mr. Rogers. Many of you may not know that actually he was an ordained Presbyterian minister. He was actually ordained to do TV ministry. And Mr. Rogers, to me, represents, in many ways, in a very profound way, this basic, essential idea of grace, and he embodied it. You talked about someone who clothed themselves with compassion and kindness, because he really believed in this core spiritual idea about who God is that we are all, every single one of us, beloved. And that ruled how he interacted with the world, that defined how the message he was trying to communicate in this children's show with puppets was this essential, simple idea that every human being is beloved and has the capacity to love other people. And it's kind of interesting to me how this simple man who ran this puppet show and children's show has now become so important to us that we see documentaries and movies about him. This simple idea, simple decency of embodying grace. And that's what he did. And that's what he taught children to do, to embody grace to their neighbor. And it doesn't seem that radical if you think about it. But the truth is, where do we find grace? We should at least find grace here, right? That we as a church should embody that grace, that sense of being the beloved community and being willing to be clothed in compassion and kindness, not only towards each other, but to all around us. There is incredible power if we are just grateful. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.